Hi there. Right, well, and welcome to my kitchen for those of you who haven't seen it before. I said that if anybody asked, I'd have a go at some 5 or 10 minute revision videos, and I've been asked to make a couple. And the first one that I've been asked to make was something on government spending and deficits. So, by deficit, obviously, the most important, at this point, the deficit that's going to be talked about is the budget or the fiscal deficit, not the trade deficit. So it's very important to be clear on the difference between those two. So the budget or fiscal deficit means that government spending is greater than the amount of money that the government raises in tax, whereas the trade deficit is not, well, more or less unrelated. There are some links, but not that you need to worry about it at AS level. And the trade deficit, or current account deficit, means that imports are greater than exports. And what we're going to be talking about here is government spending and the budget or fiscal deficit. So we take government spending. We know from microeconomics that the government needs to spend money for a whole variety of reasons. And many of these are to do with correcting market failure. So hence the government will spend money on public goods such as the army, the police force and so on, because those goods are both non-excludable and non-diminishable, meaning that they wouldn't be provided in the free market. The government also subsidises or provides merit goods, goods that could be provided through the market, because they're private goods, they are excludable and diminishable. We'll talk about things like education and health. But if they were only provided through the market, then they would be underprovided, and again there would be a welfare loss. So government also provides infrastructure. Now, arguably, what roads and rail links are is unclear. Some people argue they're public goods. Some people argue they have external benefits. But the government provides a wide range of goods and services, and obviously to do this, it needs to generate tax revenue. If it doesn't have enough tax revenue to reach the level of spending that it wishes to achieve, then it's going to have to borrow, and that's that borrowing is the budget deficit. And if the government borrows every year, those budget deficits add up, and they increase the level of the national debt, which is the total amount of outstanding borrowing that the government has engaged in. So it's all the money from when Noah built the ark, that still hasn't been paid back, and on which the government's going to have to pay interest. So, as far as government spending is concerned, then you can categorise it into two broad categories. The vast majority of government spending, probably about 90% of it, is what's called current spending, and current spending is just the running expenses of the government sector. The government does lots of things. It has, as we say, it provides the army, it provides the health service, and so on. These have everyday expenses which have to be paid, month after month after month. These include things like the salaries of nurses and teachers and members of the armed forces. It includes things like consumables, things like medicines in the health service. So, that's a high percentage of the government's budget, and by the government changing current spending, it means that directly there are more orders for things like pharmaceuticals, so that creates demand for firms. Secondly, it may increase the salaries of public sector workers, so they have more money, so again consumption may rise. The second category, which is generally much smaller, is capital spending, and these are infrastructure projects, one-off projects that the government might engage in. I mean, the most obvious one at the moment is something like HS2, but there've been, but it includes things like building new hospitals and new schools and so on. The difference with between capital spending and current spending in a theoretical sense is that capital spending will also increase aggregate demand. I mean, you can't travel on HS2 until somebody's built it. The government will then use its spending to employ private sector firms to build these links. Therefore, aggregate demand, the total demand for UK firms' goods and services, will rise, and there'll be multiplier effects through the economy. But secondly, in the long term, obviously, we get to use these things like schools and hospitals and road and rail links and so on, and these help firms to become more efficient, help them to deliver their goods more effectively, for example, or to move things around more cheaply. Blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's a variety of ways in which that might be true. But what we're saying then is that if it improves the efficiency of businesses and so on, or it allows more workers to access the workforce and so on, then that can also have an impact on potential growth. It can shift aggregate supply of the PPF, however you want to see it, to the right. So the other question then linked to that is then the deficit. As I'm sure all of you are aware, the level of government borrowing is very great. I mean, where exactly it's going to be this year is hard to forecast, but it's certainly going to be probably north of £75 billion, and it's been as high as £175 billion a year over the last 3 or 4 years. The national debt has now reached 80% of GDP. So why is this? How to explain the size of the budget deficit? Why do we care about that? And what, if anything, can be done about it? I mean, you don't need to know this in huge detail at AS level. It's more of an A2 topic. But why is the deficit so large? And the answer is pretty straightforward, which is that when the economy is performing badly, then 2 things happen. We know that as aggregate demand falls and the economy heads into recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth or 6 months of falling output, we know that what happens is that firstly unemployment tends to rise. Therefore, government spending on transfers, government spending on things like unemployment benefit and income support and housing credits and so on, these all increase. In other words, because fewer people have jobs, more people are in poverty, the government ends up spending more. So automatically, government spending increases. But at the same time, of course, as GDP falls and as people lose their jobs, they don't spend as much. So therefore, VAT falls because fewer people, VAT receipts fall rather. People lose their jobs, so therefore they're not paying income tax. Corporate profits fall, so therefore they're not paying corporation tax. So as a result, during an economic downturn, firstly, government spending automatically rises, and secondly, tax receipts automatically fall. So as a result, we end up with a deficit. So why does that matter? I mean, there are a variety of complex pieces of economic theory that explain this, but the most obvious one is that if you've got big debt, you've got to pay interest on it. At the moment, we're paying somewhere between 50 and 55 billion pounds a year just on paying the interest on the national debt. And it's worth thinking, it's worth comparing that with, say, the education budget, which is 100 billion. So an amount equivalent to half of the education budget is just being spent paying debt interest. Or again, to put it into context, it's much more. I mean, the defence budget is somewhere around about 40 billion pounds. So we're spending more just on paying interest on the debt than we are on national defence or the police force and so on. So we can worry about that. A second worry is that the more you borrow, the worse as a government your credit rating is. So Greece finds it very difficult and very expensive to borrow money, because they have such a large national debt. So if you keep on borrowing every year, your budget deficit, your fiscal deficits add to your national debt, which can damage your credit rating. So what do you do about it? There are 2 schools of thought. Keynesians largely would argue not to worry too much about it. In other words, if what you do about it is you decide to try and, say, increase tax, Keynesians would worry that actually it won't really help very much, because by increasing tax you'll reduce demand, by reducing demand you'll create more unemployment, you're kind of back where you started. There's another bunch of economists that say that the problem is so serious that it'd be far better to do this, to increase taxes. The impact wouldn't be that bad. They'd say it would help to restore business confidence because they'd believe you were getting the deficit under control. They'd be more likely to invest and so on. But this is really an A2 topic. So as far as this revision video is concerned, we need to understand why governments spend money, often to provide public merit goods and so on, to provide infrastructure, or also to kind of reduce inequality, provide benefits and so on. We can say that the 2 main areas of government spending are capital and current spending, which we defined earlier. Capital, roughly infrastructure spending; current spending, roughly kind of running expense of the government sector. And we can understand that the government's finances can be in one of 3 states. Most recently, budgets have been in deficit with government spending more than tax, meaning the government has to borrow. They could be balanced with government spending equal to tax. Or, technically there could be a budget or a fiscal surplus, but this hasn't happened for a long time, where the government actually has more tax revenue than it has government spending, and it can start to reduce, it can start to pay back some of that national debt. If you've got any worries, send me an email.